The oak tree. Margaret and Sean arrived in early spring, hopeful and brimming with excitement. The house was perfect, a quaint two-story nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood with a lush, fenced-in backyard. Most impressive of all was the ancient oak tree that spread its branches proudly over the grass, its trunk thick as a fortress column. From the very beginning, the young couple found themselves captivated by the tree's silent, venerable presence. Margaret was several months pregnant, and she imagined their child one day swinging on a tire tied to one of the sturdy branches. Sean, too, seemed delighted by the oak, often admiring the gnarled trunk and running his hand across the ridges of its bark like one might caress the back of a beloved pet. It was their shared dream to raise a family under that tranquil canopy. But as the weeks passed, Sean's attachment to the oak tree grew peculiar. Margaret would find him outside after midnight, leaning against the trunk, whispering. The bark would seem to shift, pulsing with eerie life under the glow of the porch light. Each time Margaret asked him about it, Emmett shrugged it off. "It's just so beautiful," he'd say. Yet there was a distant, feverish glint in his eyes. Soon Margaret began to hear voices of her own, breathy, rustling murmurs that seemed to slip between the leaves. At first she told herself it was only the wind, but then one day she overheard Sean whisper her name to the tree, and a soft, malevolent rustle responded. A chill shot through her. That night she pretended to sleep and waited for Sean to slide out of the bed at midnight. She then followed him to the backyard where she watched him hugged and passionately caress the oak. In that dark corner of the backyard, she was close enough to hear the oak moan with pleasure. She understood, in a single, dreadful moment. Something in the oak was not just alive, but hungry, and Sean had fallen madly in love with it. Her husband had an affair with the oak tree. "What were you doing in the backyard last night?" Margaret asked him next morning at the breakfast table. He had only came back to bed at dawn. "What do you mean?" Sean said, cold and distant. "I saw you with the tree last." Margaret paused. Sean's gaze froze her. He had never looked at her like that, with despise, even hatred. "What were you doing out?" Sean asked. She said nothing, couldn't move a muscle. "What were you doing out there? You followed me?" Sean was leaning against the table and yelling at her. After that fight, Margaret decided not bring the subject up anymore. But it wasn't easy. Night after night he went to the backyard to the oak. He lost weight. He almost never ate anymore. He barely talked to her, and if he did in occasions, he just yelled. As her due date got closer, his abusive behavior got worse. Now she was worried about her baby, so she decided to leave him. One afternoon she packed a suitcase and left it next to the door and went back in to get her car keys. When she came back, Sean was waiting for her next to her suitcase, a lanky, darkened, bent, dried-up figure with a pair of dead eyes. "You're going somewhere?" he grunted. Margaret took a step back. She was going to say no when Sean attacked her. When she came to, it was dark outside. She was laid on the kitchen floor. Her head was heavy, her mouth bitter. She touched the dried blood on her forehead with the tip of her fingers. Then he heard Sean from backyard. Sean was digging a hole next to the tree and talking to it when Margaret stumbled out. When Sean saw her on her feet, he dropped the shovel and ran to her. Margaret turned and ran inside. She tried to get out of the house, but the door was locked. When Sean finally caught up to her, she had run to the kitchen and reached for the 30-centimeter kitchen knife. A moment later, when Sean's hand went up to hit her in the head again, the knife was plunged into his heart. When she finally stopped screaming and fell down next to her husband-dead boy, she heard the oak crying. Shaking with grief and pain, Margaret stumbled outside, grabbed a can of gasoline from the shed, and aimed Fort He Oak. She could feel the tree's malevolence pressing down on her. The monstrous trunk loomed, its branches quivering in grief. She doused the roots, intending to burn the tree once and for all. But as she stepped backward, one gnarled root snaked up from the ground. She stumbled over it, lost her balance, and crashed into the hole her husband had dug. The pain shot through her belly like a sharp knife, as if her baby clutched on her baby in fear. She tried to get up, but the oak's roots held her down. As she struggled, she realized the roots are covering her with dirt. The oak was burying her and her baby alive. She gathered every ounce of remaining energy in her body to cry for help, but the roots filled her mouth with soil. The last thing she heard in her grave was her baby's ever-fainting heartbeat.